Now it's got the red light on. It's flashing at me. All right. So if you recall, last week we started looking at one of the videos there after we'd had some discussion just in broad general sense about application and how to bring things into application. Does anybody remember the topic that we sort of covered last week?
Puritans.
The Puritans. Who were the Puritans? And if nothing else, we learned that they probably didn't have buckles on their hats. And they may not have dressed the way that we thought that they did, or at least all of them didn't. I'm going to pick up just a little bit more with that, but the main reason for going down this path is this is going to lead us to, let me pull up the chart that I want to show here. This is going to lead us to the understanding of two of the other breaks on the chart that we've been using sort of as our guide to cover this evolution over time. One of them is going to be the break here that we eventually get to sometime around 1607, where this is the break off that leads to what we think of as being the Congregationalist movement and then Baptists as well. But this is also going to inform the break that we have up here at the top, where Methodists break off from the Anglican Church. And so a lot of this is setting the background for what's going on inside of not just England, but mostly England, because we derive the churches that we know here in North America primarily from, not exclusively from, but primarily from their English roots. And so we're laying the backdrop here of what's going on inside the Church of England, because it plays to an understanding of both this break, which is the next next major break that we're going to take, and then the other break, which is the break off here at the top, where Methodists break off of the Anglican Church. Anglican, again, meaning the Church of England. And so if you recall, just really quickly without going back too far, but it helps to set the stage, helps me to set the stage as well. We spent a good amount of time talking about the timeline of the English monarchy going back to Henry VII, Henry VIII, all the stuff around him, and the break because of Henry wanting his divorce and the Act of Supremacy. And we talked some about Edward, his son, the 9 days of Lady Jane Grey, Mary, who we know as Bloody Mary, Elizabeth, and then James. So the period of time that we sort of covered last week, or the part of what Ryan Reeves covered in that overview, a lot of it is during this period of time in the early 16th century. So this is after 1517, and the theses are attacked in Germany, and after 1534, which is the date that the Act of Supremacy happens. Somebody have a question? The key thing to remember as we slide into here, because then we're going to pick up very quickly, is when we talk about the Tudors, who is the last Tudor? That's a monarch.
Elizabeth.
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 Yeah. She is, of course, Henry's daughter, the second of his two daughters. Three of Henry's children sat on the throne. Edward, Mary, and then Elizabeth. Elizabeth is the last. Elizabeth never marries, and Elizabeth never produces an heir. And so it's the transition between Elizabeth and James that represents the transition from the Tudor to the Stewart houses. Does anybody remember where James comes from?
It's Henry's younger sister's first son.
That is correct. My wife has been forced by myself and my daughter to sit through plenty of historical dramas, and I think probably has a better grasp of this than she had before, and candidly more than she ever probably really ever wanted. And he was James on this chart we're looking at here, he's listed as James the First, but he was also actually James the Sixth of Scotland. And so he is my daughter likes to use this term, for those of you that have heard her talk about it when talking about the English crown in general, these cousin jumps, where you have to go find somebody who's the closest cousin that has the best claim to the throne. James is sort of there by the cousin jump over from Elizabeth. Why this isn't, there's several reasons why this is important. This unites England and Scotland in a different way than they had sort of been connected before. But of course, James is also well known because of what else? Normally when we think of King James, probably what we think of when we're thinking about something biblical or religious.
The King James.
King James Bible.
The Bible.
That's correct. He is the authorized version, which is the official name of that, was authorized by James. And we'll look at that a little bit today. And so today we're going to do a little bit more of the background stuff, which will include the Puritans. It'll include some other things about what's going on with the Reformation movement in England, because this will set up again those two breakoffs in different ways. It will set one of the things it'll set up is really getting us really ready to understand this break here, which leads to the Congregational and Baptist break. But it will also set the stage for what's going to happen here at the top.
Hey,
The other
Don,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, back on the slide with the monarchs. In what period then is it during the Puritans?
They're behind the scenes, really. Their emergence, as what we were looking at last week, really happens during Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth's reign is a
Okay.
long reign.
That's what I thought I remembered. Okay.
Yeah. It will progress through in different ways. We're going to see something on one of the videos that we'll use today. It's certainly prevalent during James's reign. And then just moving on to the next slide, you set me up nicely and you didn't even know you were doing it. Is we're then going to get into the reigns of James's son, Charles. Oliver Cromwell here is not descended by this house. This is the period of time of the English Civil War, when Parliament takes control, the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, and then what goes on with that. We're also going to be talking about what's going on. This is all setting the background stage for what's going on here. And the Puritans are present throughout all of this in various ways. So just to be aware of that. So I, again, just wanted to orient where we are and also why we are. We're going to spend a little more time today talking about English politics than we'd probably like, because it sets up what's going on in the English church. Because the English Reformation, as we've talked about before, is normally thought of as being primarily what a lot of times is more of a political reformation than a spiritual reformation. But it's definitely there's a spiritual element to it as well. So just real quick to orient you here so you can put some, these probably are more what their faces look like. This is the House of Stewart and ultimately the House of Orange, as we see it progressing down. So James VI of Scotland, James I, he was married to a princess from Denmark. His son Charles is going to be the next king. Then after Charles, who is executed in 1649, there's a period of time where there is no king. There's the restoration of the monarchy under his son, Charles II, in 1660, 1661. That is short-lived. And then James II, who is also Charles's son, is king till 1688. And then there's the Glorious Revolution. And at that time, they bring another branch of the house over in the case of William and his wife, Mary. This is the William and Mary when you hear William and Mary fame. And they're technically attached to the House of Stewart, but they're considered the House of Orange. So some of this we won't get to as much, except to say that all of this is happening during the period of time when there's English settlement going on in North America. So we'll talk about this connection between, our thought about the Pilgrims and who's coming because they have to come because they're being persecuted, or who's coming because they want to come. All of this is the backdrop for colonization in what will become the United States, and how the various denominations and religious thoughts come across the Atlantic over to be on our continent and not back on that continent. So that sort of sets a little bit of the background. Now, if I'm smart enough to do this, I'm actually going to go back in and we're going to pick back up with.
I always turned on the issue of adiaphora.
Ken, once he does this, he can do it. So I'm going to start this. This is picking up more or less where we were last week. And we'll run this for a little bit. Again, we'll do what we did last week. We'll pause and discuss so that it's not just, playing a video kind of thing. So can everybody see the video starting up on their screen?
Yes.
Okay, and last week I turned on the closed captions just because I think they're helpful to some degree, maybe as
Yeah.
well. So if you'll confirm, hold on, do one other thing here. Make sure that I am sharing my sound. Okay, I am. But let me know just with a thumbs up or just a quick yes that you can hear things once I get it rolling. So I'll start that now.
And you'll recall from our lecture about Melanchthon and the Augsburg Interim under Lutheranism, this fight about what are the essentials, what can we all agree on, and what things should be considered, quote, indifferent, which is a word we said would be translated in the 21st century to mean things that are non-essential. What happens here in England is the debate about adiaphora or non-essentials begins to divide a bit. The old model for understanding things that are not essential, as it arose in the Augsburg Interim, was a commitment to the idea that you could participate in things, if required, so long as they were not part of the essentials of the faith. Meaning if you disagreed with something, yet you were asked to do it because it was part of your, let's say, job description, or because the sovereign of a country was saying, I want you to do X or Y. Adiaphora, that doctrine always said, well, you can embrace these things and do them, even if your conscience says you don't really like them, because it's not essential and you can obey. What happened under Elizabeth, though, is increasingly people began to say that if it's not essential, if it's adiaphora, then no one should be required to do them. Now, this is an important shift because
We talked about this a little last week, but just to connect things in, this idea of adiaphora. So it's how would you, just anybody who wants to, how would you describe what it is? What is adiaphora?
The color of the carpet.
So that's a sample or example of one. It's something that is not.
If it's not that important, it doesn't matter if I do it or not. But under Elizabeth, there was an important shift that if it's not important, then no one should have to do it.
Yeah, and you understand the shift there. The one thing is, it doesn't matter. It's indifferent, right? It's not essential. The other thing, well, if it's not essential, why are we even doing it? Those are the same thing, but do you see how they're different?
Yeah, but I mean, like, if it was to be a member of the church in good standing, I had to wear, I don't know, something purple, or I had to wear a cross pendant or something like that. That didn't, but my job said I couldn't wear a necklace or something like that. That would be considered a non-essential. I didn't have to
And the
wear the cross.
and the non-essentials and the essentials for the most part were things that were required in the church, not the other way around.
Okay.
So, we would prefer that when you come into the worship space, I'm not saying this was the case during that, but you do sort of the Catholic, cross yourself. That's not required, but it's sort of preferred. But, maybe that was considered to be a non-essential by the time of the Protestant period of there. And so what happens is, and we talked about this before, let's see if I can go back to it. Got to come back to 1022 when I do, is that what you ended up having was, remember, the difference here was there was the idea of conformist versus separatists. And that's what we're going to continue to work through here, is this idea of, are you reforming or changing the church, or are you, that's where I wanted to go. Are you conforming it, or are you separating yourself from it? And there came to be more separatists, that's what I'm looking for, over time, where the idea was not just, the Puritan idea was not just change the church, it was actually we can't change the church, and so we are going to separate from the church. And this is the period that we're going into now in a little bit more depth, is where that's going to be something that's a little bit more prevalent.
important shift, because what begins to happen is you see an emergence of those saying that things should not be imposed upon them at all at the level of their conscience. The shift, in other words, is Puritans by and large, and eventually separatists, become increasingly unhappy with the fact that they're being asked to do things that they are not required to do according to the gospel. It's a shift, in other words, about the application of the understanding of adiaphora. When James I comes to the throne, though, and we'll see this in our next lecture, he is relatively in favor, or at least understanding, of the Puritan method or the Puritan way of life. He agreed with some of their perspectives about the stagnation of reform within the church. Yet he did not agree with them fully about all the ways that they were requiring people to stop doing things because they didn't like them.
So here's the switch. Elizabeth has been queen for, she's from 58 until her death in 1603. So when James comes, we talked about this at some point in the past, just want to set this stage without having to have a video do it for multiple minutes, is what has gone on in Scotland before James has come down? Does anybody remember? I'll give you a hint in that the Calvinism and Reformed theology spreads to Scotland and eventually becomes, in fact, Presbyterians as we know them today are the church that comes out of Scotland. So there's been a Protestant move in Scotland that has brought a lot of the more traditional Calvinistic Reformed theology to Scotland. James Knox is the personage in history that does that and brings things forward. And Scotland has become far, far, far less tied to Catholic thought in the period of time while Elizabeth has been the monarch in England. And of course, during part of that time, James has been the monarch in Scotland. So when he comes down, there's already, Elizabeth is Protestant and has continued the Protestant stance. Has been sort of a moderating force, not letting one thing dominate over the other. Remember, we talked about just the whipsaw back and forth between Mary and the back and forth part there. So when James comes, he comes bringing definitely a Protestant tradition, or the Scottish Protestant tradition with him. So I'm now going to flip over to another video that really starts talking about his arrival and what's going on with that. And you'll see how immediately that kicks into play because James is coming down. So we're in 1603 now with James coming down to actually assume the throne. And that's where we're going to sort of pick the story up. The answer is yes. That's what we're going to do now.
So in 1603, after this rich upbringing and education, James is appointed to be king of both Scotland, and now he is going to be king of England, taking over from Elizabeth. Now, James very much wanted this. England, he said, was an upgrade. He actually makes an analogy. He said, I was sleeping with a rock for my pillow, and now I have a feathered bed, now that he's moved to England. He tells them that he'll be back in 2 or 3 years after he has established himself as King of England, but he never once again sets foot back on Scottish soil. The takeover of the English throne, though, by James unites the kingdoms of Scotland and England in a very real way for, honestly, the first time. There have always been claims back and forth, particularly by the English, that they own Scotland. Just see the movie Braveheart if you want to see some of this in fictional action. And throughout the Middle Ages, there were times where Scotland was under the thumb of the English kings, but they always resisted it, and frankly, they still do today. They do not want to be vassals or subordinates to the English. Even if they are one, they want to be separate but equal, you might say. James' policy all throughout his reign and the policy of his son Charles is to attempt to make sure that this union between the two crowns sticks. That the Tudor dynasty, now taken over by the Stewart, blends, at least to the extent that it can, with the Scottish heritage and its ethos. So that's the political background. James comes to England. What's James' role, though, in terms of theology in the church? Well, it's pretty significant. When James is literally on the road, you might say, heading down to England to take over the throne, he is met along the way by a group that we would later call Puritan, a disgruntled band of pastors within the Church of England who put in James' hand something that is today known as the Millenary Petition. Now, it's called the Millenary Petition because it is alleged to have 1,000 signatures upon it. Miles in Latin is the word for 1,000. And the Millenary Petition was, again, it's a more or less Puritan document. It's laying before James the things that those who were disgruntled with the Anglican Church hope to see reform on. Over the course of Elizabeth's reign, a lot of these folks felt very stifled. A number of their concerns were ticky-tack, let's just be honest, and you'll see this here in this petition. But what is happening is those who are conformist, and given the tone of the Elizabethan and Anglican heritage that we saw in a previous lecture, those who had small criticisms of change, because they feel stifled, they eventually begin to create more, and the problems fester because they're not given the opportunity to be aired out and for the grievances to be at least somewhat respected.
So picking back up on my wife's example of the color of the carpet, if the carpet has been orange for 25 years in the church, and you really, 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 really hate the orange carpet, but you don't feel like you can complain to anybody who can do anything about the orange carpet, again, assuming that orange is an offensive color, maybe it's not to some of you. How do you think that feels eventually after a period of time?
Irritating.
What's more irritating, the carpet or the fact that you feel like you really can't complain about it?
The fact you can't complain about it.
Yeah, so this is sort of the backdrop that's happened here is Elizabeth has generally charted a middle course, but she hasn't been very tolerant of anything that pushes in either direction, back towards Catholicism or advancing the Reformation or the English Reformation or Protestantism in the other direction. Part of her gift as a monarch is to be steady. It also becomes part of what sets the stage for now that there's a change. Okay, we haven't been able to address this. Now we want to address this. So do they even, did you notice, or do they even wait for James to get to London?
Meet him on the road.
We're going to catch him on the way and give him our list of things we want done. And so that, again, that sort of sets the backdrop here. Here's the other thing I want to point out. When did Luther tack the theses to the door? We all know the date well now, right? 1517. This is 1603. There's a tendency in my head, I don't know if you have the same tendency in your head, to compact all of this down to a fairly, we're covering it in a matter of months, so it seems like it happens really quickly. 1517 to 1603 obviously is almost a full century. So it's not like the idea of Reformation is really new, right? We're actually second and third generations removed from it by the time we get here. So I think that's just an important thing to say because it's easy for me to sort of forget that all this is happening, over a longer period of time. That's the difference there is 17 to 3 is 14. So it's 86 years from 1517 to 1603. Go back 86 years from now to figure out where that puts you back in time, and you get a sense for how much time has elapsed, right? You go back 86 years, where would you be? In late 1930s. So that just thinking about, the 1930s to now for us is the same period of time we're talking about here, 1603 back to Luther's tacking of the theses. Just keeping that in perspective is a helpful thing because I want to sort of make all this happening like it's happening, 1 year after the next kind of thing, and it's not. This is a long, slow burn. Questions or comments about that?
Is the video going to get into?
It's going to get into what's on the list. Yeah, that's what's coming next.
It's only human, in fact. You have one criticism, no one wants to listen to it, and suddenly you go, well, I have 7 more now. I have all these other ones now to add to that original one. It's a bit like that. By this point, in 1603, the unhappy Puritans there within the English church have a number of things that they hope to see change on. Now, perhaps the best way to see this before I give you some of these elements that they hope to change is that these are proxy wars. A proxy war, you might know from modern politics, is whenever two behemoth countries want to go to war, but they don't really want to go into total war against one another, will often meet on a smaller playing field or over a smaller matter and try to support different sides. Just see, by the way, the Korean War or the Vietnam War as an example of this. Vietnam was not just about Vietnam, it was about communism from places like China going up against American capitalism. There they were meeting face to face on this turf war. So a proxy war is whenever there's something big, some elephant in the room, but they start to fight about sub things or small things on the side. Another analogy is whenever you see a married couple fighting about the dishes, they're not just fighting about the dishes, they're fighting about something else more fundamental. It's just the dishes are the thing that they're expressing that frustration through. That's really more where the Puritans are coming from. They're coming more from a position of being concerned that no one really wants to talk about, are we living biblically in the context of our worship? Or are we just simply embracing and affirming traditions simply because we like them? Why aren't we being more careful? And why do we have things that seem to be traditional medieval Catholic if there's not a principled reason for embracing them? And so lots of things begin to fester. So the millenary petition lists a number of things that they want to see changed. They don't like, for example, the making of the sign of the cross on the infant during baptism. This is seen, they believe, as superstitious. Some of the medieval view that baptism is some kind of talisman that de facto brings the Holy Spirit into the baby. Like those under Elizabeth, they call not for the end of vestments, but for them to be made optional. That those who have a conscience against it can opt not to wear them. Elizabeth, of course, had always said, nope, put them on. They also don't want wedding rings. This is a bit of a strange one, but they found that the use of a wedding ring for marriage was, at least they allege, superstitious. Why do I need a band around my finger of some precious metal that tells me that my marriage is somehow signed and sealed by God? That's superstition, they said. The other one, which I always get a chuckle at, they were pretty concerned about the observance of Sabbath. Now, again, this is a proxy war. They're concerned about why people aren't willing to talk about what we do and don't do on Sabbath. Everyone in this day, of course, embraced the idea that you're not supposed to work, you're supposed to rest. Well, there was a long-standing habit in the English culture that you could go out into the parks or into public spaces or even at your home and you could play games. You could have festivities, you could go out and do things like go bowling, at least an early version of it, and so on and so forth. A lot of what's in play here, though, is not so much the concern about play and recreation, but it's, again, a real commitment to the question of, are we following the Bible? Now, lots of people cluck.
Can you think of any modern examples of things like that? I'll give one that's a little older. I remember riding home, I've probably heard me tell this story before, from church when I'm a upper single digit age kid. And it seemed like every Sunday, or this is just the way that I remember it, the conversation in the car that was raised by my mom with my dad was over the question of who wore a dress and who wore a pantsuit.
Who wore a dress or pants? Wow.
That was, so we're talking here in the early to mid 70s. This seemed to have been a burning issue for my mother. Was the question of pantsuits in church on Sunday morning. Anybody think of any other types of things that may be along the lines of, the types of things that are reflective of bigger questions? That's really what Reeves is suggesting here.
Well, as a society, we had blue laws back when I was a kid.
Right. And what I remember of those, it was, I know that some of them were like, you could buy this, but you couldn't buy that. I think you could buy the nails on a Sunday, but maybe no hammer. Maybe I've got that wrong. but they were actually, broken out that way. Because, without the hammer would enable you to do work, right?
I can remember stores that would even have like taped off sections on Sunday that you couldn't even go to those aisles.
Right.
I can remember as a kid that we owned for a couple of years, especially when some of my aunts and uncles were, one of my uncles was still lived here with his kids. I had 2 different go-karts in my life. And we were able to use the parking lot at the Kmart there on the corner of the Holland and the Interstate as our version of a little raceway on Sunday afternoons. Why? Because Kmart was closed. Now you may remember at that time right next to it, I think eventually became a Kroger, but at that time maybe it was a Lewis and Coker. Am I remembering correctly? The grocery store was open. So you couldn't go down that far on the parking lot because that was open that day for the limited stuff. But we drove all around the post there. This is before other stuff was put in that parking lot. I knew that parking lot there of Kmart pretty well, not from just going there as a kid to shop, but also because I probably drove, 3,000 laps of a go-kart around the 4 posts that were there that sort of created what we used as the oval. That's changed now. So the Puritans or the Puritan leaning folks meet James on the road with this petition. So why would they go to the king with their petition of things they wanted changed?
Because the king was the head of the Anglican Church.
James, when he assumes the role of being king of England, is also going to assume the role of being the head of the church. And so he's the one that has the power to make these changes. And so that's why they greet him there.
Pluck their tongue and eye roll this. Even in their own day, the Puritans were being made fun of for this. James the First himself, in fact, in a later year, will write a book, a very famous book called The Book of Sports, of all things, in which he lists, in a somewhat conciliatory way, the types of activities you can do on Sabbath and the kinds you can't. So he allows for festivities or festivals, maypoles, and these types of fun events to go on Sabbath. But interestingly enough, James takes the Puritan side and he outlaws bowling on Sunday. You might say that the millenary petition, when laid before James, was asking for a pound when it should have taken an ounce. It was sort of spewing all of these problems onto James with the assumption, the wrong assumption they're going to find out, that James will see their side on this. Well, James does call a meeting. It's called the Hampton Court Conference from 1604, in which he brings together the leaders from the church, from the Anglican Church, and these disgruntled folks from within the church as well, who had given him the millenary petition. And James' demeanor and his engagement here at this conference is really a masterstroke. It shows that he is a good king and he was trained well. James more or less keeps them both off balance. On the one hand, he excoriates the Puritans for their ticky-tack, needless complaints about all kinds of different things. He, in other words, tells them that they are asking for too much. They're complaining about everything when they should have found the root cause of a couple of things that they found to be abhorrent. Well, the church leadership on the other side of the aisle began to sort of stroke their peacock feathers and feel that they had won the day, at which point James turns on them and blasts them for not hearing their brethren, not being concerned for good order or good worship, and for simply sticking it to the Puritans all of these years. This is good leadership, probably good parenting, by the way. You have 2 siblings fighting within the same household. Both are probably wrong here. There's not one who is the saintly one and one who is the annoying, complaining one. And so he churns on both of them, but he also affirms both of them in a fundamental way. What James does, though, is, again, a masterstroke. He notices that the Bible in English had not been updated or really given much attention throughout Elizabeth's reign. There had been a translation called the Bishop's Bible, but it was more or less a dusted-up version of an earlier 16th century version of the Bible in English. James, realizing that both are committed Protestants and both are committed to the Bible, turns and instructs both of them to work together and to translate and produce what would eventually become known as the authorized version of the Bible. In the American context, it's sometimes called the King James Bible.
So how do we end up getting the King James Bible?
Through conflict.
Through conflict. Does that surprise anyone?
No.
Why not?
Well, I guess you could say yes and no. Conflict has been throughout the church, but I guess you could also say it is surprising that they actually came together and produced the Bible in English.
Conflict sometimes create more creative solutions.
I'm sorry, Bill, can you repeat that?
Conflict sometimes creates more creative solutions.
That's true. There, we've been through leadership training where it talks about, the creative tension that conflict can bring. Conflict can bring good things if it's managed properly. Dr. Reeves just stated here, what was one of the other reasons for using the Bible as sort of this thing that was then going to be a joint project for them, which that's the way I interpret it, is that one of the ways you guys will quit fighting with each other is if I put you on something where you have to cooperate and work together to produce an outcome that you both want, right? So why was choosing the Bible, I guess, James's good thought? What made that a good thought?
It was something they agreed upon.
Right. And these arguments, be they big or be they small, were arguments over what? What the Bible said should or shouldn't be. So it was an excellent way to focus them on resolving their conflict, but also doing it in a way that was around the very thing that they were actually having conflict over. And the other thing was there was a need for it. There hadn't really been an updated translation into English. In fact, still most of what even survives through the King James Bible, through the authorized version, is still a lot of Tyndale's original translation work, because that's how good Tyndale's translation work was. But we'll see there's a little bit more to that as well. Any questions or comments about the last little section there before I restart things? The year of the authorized Bible, by the way, is 1611. So you notice the conference was in 1604. So as you can see, it took about 7 years to actually produce the Bible.
In its original, it was called the Authorized Bible because it had been authorized by the government. No one called it the King James Bible. Again, this is a masterstroke. He puts them both to work on something they're concerned about, and it gets them off of the problems that they're all squabbling about. From 1604 to 1611, they devote themselves to translating the Bible back from the originals into a new, you might say, a Shakespearean-influenced English. The other thing that James demands is that there be nothing in the Bible except the text itself.
We are so accustomed to and get the benefit from our modern study Bibles with notes and concordances and all of these other things. It's interesting to note that the way that we see that is a very modern thing, the Schofield Study Bible in the late 19th century being one of the first examples of that. But it was common before to include notes or other things in the Bible. So when James comes along and says, when you do this translation, it's not going to be a bunch of notes and a lot of this. The Bible is going to be the Bible. Why do you think he gave that instruction?
So they wouldn't start squabbling again.
If you started talking about what was going to be in the note, you were going to spend a lot of time arguing what was going to be in the note, right? True. So, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It looked like it wanted to, it did stop my video. Looked like it wanted to change my audio output. So I think that's exactly right. We're not going to have footnotes. We're not going to have these other notes because that's what you're going to spend all your time arguing over instead of what the proper language should be. So The Bible is to be translated into English, and it is just to be the Bible.
It's interesting.
No comments, no liturgy, nothing. Let the Word of God stand on its own, he argued. And so if you ever see editions of the authorized Bible from this day and age, it's very, very majestic, the translation, but it's also clean. There are no comments or theologies woven within it. And here's the thing. So many folks all throughout the centuries have been KJV only. They've had a sort of superstitious view of the King James Bible. But don't let that cloud our view of the authorized Bible. It really is a masterpiece. Its translational value in its own day is staggering. Even if it sounds archaic and old to us today, when you go and read the original King James Bible, still it is in its own day, again, something like Shakespeare putting the English language on display as a vehicle for translating the Bible. As one historian once put it, the authorized Bible gave God an English accent. And for a number of years and for a number of centuries, actually, it is widely read and used as the English text for anyone who's going to be a Christian in the context of the English world. It's even, by the way, used by those who break apart from the English church and go their own way denominationally. It's just that important. In some ways, the KJV only folks got going because when new texts, new manuscripts, in particular new Greek manuscripts, were discovered that helped us correct and polish up and get rid of certain verses that were mistranslated in the KJV, it had stood the test for so long that it felt as if people were tinkering with the real Bible itself. And so while I don't believe in the KJV only mythology about its origin or about the Textus Receptus, a lot of what's driving this culturally is this belief that this is the best translation to use. And for a number of years it was. One last thing, though, that happened under James that really galvanized all these disparate parts for a time was the gunpowder plot of 1605. Some of you have probably heard the slogan, "Remember, remember the 5th of November." Well, that comes directly from the gunpowder plot. The story is a man by the name of Guy Fawkes, as well as a number of others, were Roman Catholics who were disgruntled and angry at the loss of the Catholic witness in England because of the Tudors. And in this day and age, you could rent space beneath Parliament, these storage chambers, and he does this, and the plot was that they would roll these barrels of gunpowder down there beneath Parliament. And the idea was that with the calling of a Parliament at some point in 1605, as well as the convocation across the street with Westminster Abbey, that they would simply blow up Parliament. Now, the amount of gunpowder he puts down there in the storage area, and just simply the physics of it, the fact that you're putting a massive amount of combustible material beneath a building, needs to be appreciated. Historians have actually done computer models as to what would have happened if the plot had been carried out. And essentially, blowing up Parliament would have made all the fragments and the debris from Parliament something like a shotgun. All these pieces of stone would have flown all throughout what is now downtown London, and a widespread amount would have been destroyed entirely. Now, Guy Fawkes in the plot is discovered almost really at the last moment. And he and his entourage of folks who were plotting this, of course, were executed in the worst possible way. But above and beyond this, the Guy Fawkes conspiracy, the gunpowder plot, galvanized all the Protestants who were fighting amongst themselves, because now there was this mutual enemy of this really suspicious Catholicism that they now believed were terrorists, you might say, in their midst. For a number of years, in fact, James rules for another 20 years after the gunpowder plot. It is a relatively peaceful reign. He has the church and those who are squabbling within the church, the leadership, working themselves towards this new translation. And he does a fair amount of back and forth and a balancing act between both sides. And now that they have a mutual enemy in this rogue terrorist Catholicism, at least that's how they see it, there is relative peace. Well, James dies in 1625, and onto the throne comes his son Charles. And if James' rule was a masterstroke of leadership and balance between opposing sides, Charles has, let's just say it, none of his father's charm or his wit. And Charles I, as we'll see in our next lecture, almost single-handedly creates the context that launches the English Civil War.
So Guy Fawkes was Catholic.
Yeah,
he was opposed to what was going on
Right.
with the Church of England.
right. And most of you have heard the remember the 5th of November. That's the date of the gunpowder plot. So I actually remember reading this about a year ago, doing some study before doing some of the study for this, but doing study for something else, that you might think of the gunpowder plot, and you may have seen some of the similarities there in terms of what it did to the English culture and the English people. Was it was almost like a 9/11 type of event that got averted. In terms of when you hear Dr. Reeves there describe what would have been the outcome. I've seen a couple of documentaries on what this might have been like if literally the rooms and rooms and rooms and rooms of gunpowder that were underneath. Just the concept of that, of, you can rent the space under the, imagine renting the space under the U.S. Capitol, then put whatever you want to there. So if you want to load, some stuff that can explode, feel free. But it would have been somewhat devastating. But you heard Dr. Reeves say that what was the result of that in terms of what happened in the background? The Protestants who had been at each other to some degree, what we just saw in the Hampton Conference, the Hampton Road Conference, now are united, or more united with each other because they view
Outside threat.
an outside threat. And that's a pretty common, theme throughout history. It's also a dangerous thing throughout history. I'll put in that little note, at least in my mind, but it is something that happens frequently. So they're working together on a translation of the Bible. This happens and this is averted. And so between James's skill as a monarch, what he's done, which was already outlined there in terms of getting the two of them in a cooperative mode versus a contentious mode, is one thing. But then there's this external thing that happens the next year, 1605, that sort of galvanizes them to not be focusing on the minors, but instead be focusing on the majors, as it's talked about there up until 1623, which is the end of James's, when he dies. Things are pretty calm and pretty stable. And so there is a little bit of more reform that's brought into the church during that period of time, but there are Puritans of different flavors that are all sort of residing and working together, even though they don't agree on everything. They clearly didn't agree on everything because they put the petition before him, right, in 1603. But they're in a much more cooperative mode. Questions, comments? Is there any application for that for us?
I was immediately thinking of 9/11, how it kind of, the tragedy drew both sides of the government kind of together a little bit, but it made me even think of what happened earlier this year when people stormed Washington, D.C. I mean, there were a lot of people that were appalled by the tyranny of it, and I think people on both sides spoke out against it. So that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, mine too. Other thoughts?
I have a question about when he had the gunpowder under, how did they remove all of that?
I don't know the answer to that. I think after that, they did stop allowing just people to rent space underneath Parliament. I don't know. That's a good question. Now the history buff in me wants to go back and figure out what happened after the fact there. And again, what it also shows is there still was a Catholic even though it had been through Elizabeth's entire reign post Mary back in the 1540s, there still was a contention that was there. It was bubbling underneath the surface, so to speak. So where we will pick up on things next week is we'll pick up just a little bit of the history, because we've talked about James's reign here and how he sort of balanced the two sides, even inside of the Church of England, in a positive way. As was alluded to by Dr. Reeves there at the end of that video, his son was not nearly as skilled in that respect. And as a result of that, we're going to see that once Charles takes the throne, things start being different inside of what's going on inside of the Reformation in England. And we'll see how that changes the way that interaction takes place, and how that interaction then sort of changes moving forward with history. This is true throughout the entire Reformation across all of Europe. There is always a play between the politics and the theology, but we're going to see it arise again in the English side of this things. And that does have an influence on our denomination and on other denominations that we know of, that we're more familiar with, because some of them are born and have their character defined during the period during the period that has happened under Elizabeth and James, but more so under the period that's underneath Charles. And so I wanted to give this sort of background, because we're going to see a couple of different things when we start going back and looking specifically at the various denominations and their beliefs, to see how the political environment was affecting the theological environment, how the theological environment was affecting the political environment. Questions, comments? All right. I'm about to stop the recording. And we are